I think Mr. Kenney has misjudged Alberta. It's in times like these when Albertans pull together and we stand up for one another. We cannot let fear and division win.
We do phase one of ending the Trudeau-Notley alliance on April 16th. And then in October, we have an opportunity to end what has been the most anti-Alberta federal government in our modern history.
Just some of the campaign messaging from the two main party leaders in Alberta. Voters head to the polls on Tuesday in that province, but the outcome of the election could really affect all of us. So what will the results mean for Alberta's relationship with Ottawa? At Issue is here to dig into that and more. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Jason Markusoff joins us from Calgary tonight. I'm going to do something crazy and start with Jason tonight just because he's in battleground Calgary. What has struck me through this election, watching it from afar, Jason, is the way that Kenney has tried to set up the Prime Minister as the person that he's fighting, and as though there is this tight alliance between Justin Trudeau and Rachel Notley. How has that been working for him?
Pretty well. He's actually been really careful not to mention Notley by name in most circumstances. He tries to confer some degree of respect on her, and in large part that's because he doesn't want to be seen as woman bashing. But there is one exception to that. Whenever if he mentions her by name, it will be talking about this Notley-Trudeau alliance. He knows that right now in Alberta, one of the meanest things you can say about somebody is tying them to Trudeau. Justin Trudeau is profoundly unpopular in Alberta right now, in a way that Notley is not, in a way that Kenney is not. So tying her to Trudeau, talking about how trying to get along with Trudeau turned out to not get us pipelines, to give us more carbon taxation, to give us some environmental assessment and tanker ban bills that Alberta doesn't want, was a road to ruination. And in fact, it's caused Notley to have to take great pains to distance herself from Trudeau and knock him a bit, trying to show that, yes, she too can be mean to Justin Trudeau.
And I want to talk more about the pipelines and sort of where things might be left after next week. But Andrew, why don't you weigh in on that kind of positioning that Kenney has waged and why he's doing it and whether it's working?
Well, there's a rich tradition of that in Canadian politics. Many a premier has won power by running against Ottawa or by tying their opponents to Ottawa, or generally in politics you try to tie your opponent to whoever is unpopular in that neighborhood. So it's a pretty tried and true tactic. And also it's tapping into a sense in Alberta that they're besieged, they're surrounded, that the federal government is not pulled through for them in the way that they would think right, that they have neighboring provinces and provinces in the Federation that are essentially blockading their main export. And it's not entirely undeserved feeling, but certainly a very strong feeling in the province right now. And obviously that's something you want to tap into if you're running for power.
Is there a danger to that, Chantal?
Well, up to a point, although I'm not sure that you're going to hear many federal Liberals protesting against it, because I fully expect that if they think it's worth it, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals will be using Doug Ford's name in much the same way come next fall. So yes, it's kind of a tradition in Canadian politics. Of course, that's the first part in the case of Jason Kenney of a gamble, and the easy part. That is, I'm going to beat Justin Trudeau by proxy in Alberta. But that second part involves, for all that Alberta has seats, Justin Trudeau won't be unseated by Alberta next fall. It's going to require some cooperation from provinces like BC and Quebec that Jason Kenney has been taking shots at and wants to take shots at as premier. And it is a big gamble in the sense that come October 22nd, after the federal election, the way this is lining up, Alberta will be all in the government federally or all out in opposition.
So where does this leave us now on the issue of the pipeline? I'll start with you, Jason. Jason Kenney has said, I think he would take the caps off the emissions of the oil sands, which is a pretty important part of why the federal government agreed to build the thing. I agree. Nothing has happened yet, but it's an important part there. So
he scraps the carbon tax as well.
That's right.
He
so
creates
I
a whole bunch of different.
Where would the pipeline be left then if Kenney were to win on Tuesday?
It puts Justin Trudeau in a really tricky place when he's talking about balancing the environment and the economy, as he does every single chance he gets He's talking about what Rachel Notley was doing. Rachel Notley's climate plan was designed in part not just to clean the environment, but also to win over some anti-pipeline opponents. She didn't win them all over, but it does seem that there has been more approval in the country for the Trans Mountain Pipeline under her leadership and with her climate plan. If Kenney takes a lot of that away, which he's promising to do, that becomes harder for Trudeau. That said, if he's serious about this pipeline, if he's serious about making a reconciliation with some of the pro-pipeline First Nations bands, of which there are many, and accommodating the more concerned ones, which he's been doing, it seems like it could be a very risky game if he's going to refuse it just to spite Jason Kenney.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, yes. Of course, we're talking as though this is going to happen on Tuesday. Obviously, we don't know what is going to happen. But go ahead, sorry, Chantal.
No, but and imagining that this were to happen.
Yeah.
A reduction in emissions to meet the Paris Accord target is not just words. It does require emissions to be cut or to not grow as quickly. If you take Alberta out of the equation because its government takes itself out of it, Justin Trudeau is left with a plan that actually is even further from ever reaching those targets that he signed off on. And he has to reconcile two statements that he made. One, that the only reason that he said yes to Trans Mountain was because Alberta had taken all these steps, and two, that the Trans Mountain pipeline was absolutely in the national interest.
Yeah.
So squaring that circle is not going to be easy with an election down the road less than 6 months away for Justin Trudeau to fight.
Andrew, you weigh in on that and how this is likely to affect the current federal government.
First point is we're probably not going to meet the Paris targets no matter who's in power or what policies we bring in. It's a long way away.
Fair.
But secondly, the broad grand bargain, as I understood it, was supposed to be carbon taxes for pipelines, not pipelines for provincially imposed carbon taxes. So if Alberta revokes its current carbon tax, it seems to me the appropriate step for the federal government is to bring in its own federally imposed carbon tax in the province of Alberta. I don't think there's any necessity for it to back away from the pipeline. I don't think the pipeline should be seen as just simply an incentive for good behavior on the part of the government of Alberta. I thought the reason for the federal government to be making sure that pipelines could get built in this country was in part of its broader responsibility for the welfare of all parts of the country. So I think it would be, I understand Chantal's point, but I think it would be a hard row to hoe for them to explain we're unhappy with the result of this election, so now we're going to pull out of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I don't think that would play well in Alberta. Obviously, I don't think it would play well in other parts of the country either.
Sure.
I don't think that the carbon tax is the point. And yes, you're totally right that the federal tax comes in when the provincial tax disappears. I think it's the cap on oil sands emission and the phase out of coal-fired electricity that adds up to less emissions, and that really matter in this equation. And then once you take them out of the play, you might as well say you're not doing this anymore because you are taking out real reductions and you're not putting anything in its place.
Okay, let me pull back. Go ahead, Jason, and then I'm going to pull back a little bit. Yeah.
But if Justin Trudeau's plan to meet the Paris climate target suddenly becomes cancelling Trans Mountain, he has a huge problem with Alberta and a huge problem with sentiment out here. I mean, there is already a rising Alberta separatist sentiment out here. If that becomes his decision, cancel Trans Mountain outright because of the Paris climate targets, he has a much larger problem than some climate change issue.
And canceling Trans Mountain doesn't get us anywhere closer to the Paris targets. I mean, it doesn't affect it one way or the other. You can, I take Chantal's point about whether, if you don't want to bring in a high enough carbon tax to make your targets, then you do these other measures, so that's fair and good. But the Trans Mountain Pipeline, look, the world's going to be burning fossil fuel for the next several decades. If they're going to be doing it, they might as well burn ours. That's all that the pipeline's about.
I'll just go back to the notion that the Prime Minister has made two statements that he will have a hard time reconciling. One being that he said yes to Trans Mountain because Alberta was doing a lot to cut carbon emissions and meeting Canada's goals or working in that direction, and two, that it was in the national interest to build the pipeline. And those two are hard to fit together. They always were, but they will become very hard to fit together after Alberta pulls out of the climate change framework that the federal government has put in place.
Yeah, if Jason Kenney, there you go. Jason Kenney wins on Tuesday, things get a lot more complicated for Justin Trudeau. One quick go round. I think you've sort of broadly touched on it, but it is important for all of us to watch this election, and the reasons would be why. Jason, what is the thing that other Canadians should think about as we're watching results roll in on Tuesday?
If Notley comes into power, it's fairly status quo. People will still be frustrated in Alberta, the Conservatives, but it will signal that Alberta agrees on climate change, agrees with her softer approach on pipeline. One interesting thing to watch is how much Justin Trudeau copies some of Notley's playbook. Notley and some of her surrogates have been strip mining the social media accounts and other backgrounds of every single Conservative candidate possible to associate them with white nationalism, homophobia, racism. Some of it warranted, mind you, but to really paint a very sinister picture of Jason Kenney that is a bit over the top, is a bit exaggerative in the campaign context. And if that works for her and helps her win, you can bet your bottom dollar you're going to see Justin Trudeau making that same approach to take out Scheer.
Yeah, it's been pretty ugly. Quickly, Andrew.
I think you're already seeing that, in fact.
Yeah.
If Jason Kenney wins, then you've got a belt of Conservative premiers all the way from Alberta through to New Brunswick. 3-4 years ago, I think there was maybe one Conservative, small C Conservative government in the country. So that's a formidable belt of opposition towards the federal government, particularly on the carbon tax file. But Mr. Kenney in particular has also announced a pretty provocative and confrontational agenda in terms of having a referendum on equalization. As if that could unilaterally change the equalization formula, taking on BC and saying we're going to cut off the oil supply to BC, and of course on the carbon tax file. So we're in for quite fisticuffs at the federal provincial level.
Last word to you, Chantal.
It also, up to a point, is risky for Andrew Scheer, because if you're going to have an Alberta premier that is taking shots at BC and Quebec, and a federal Conservative leader who says, make me Prime Minister, and I'm joined at the hip with that Premier, a lot of voters in those two provinces may say, I'm not sure that's what I want.
Although, as our friend Aaron Wary wrote this morning too, it also gives the Prime Minister potential for lots of good enemies as he heads into an election too. Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to be out there on Sunday, Jason, so I'll buy you a beer. How about that?
Works for me.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're talking about lawsuit threats and the latest in, remember this, the SNC-Lavalin affair. 1 week off. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.